The morning Eliza Mercer's life cracked down the middle. She was standing on a train platform in the freezing Wyoming wind with $2 bills, a carpet bag, and 6 months of letters she had memorized line by line. She had read those letters so many times the ink had softened at the folds. She knew the handwriting the way she knew her own face, the careful loop on the capital G, the way the sentences ran long when he was nervous, the way he always signed off with yours in good faith, Garrett Boone. So when she stepped off the train at Millhaven and looked up and saw two men waiting for her, both in brown hats, both the same height, both watching her, with the same expression, she could only describe as guilty. Her first thought was not fear. Her first thought was, which one wrote those letters? And her second thought, arriving just behind the first like a stone dropped into still water, was, why didn't either of them warn me? Before the story goes any further, if you found this video, don't leave without subscribing to this channel. Stories like this one about ordinary people, caught in extraordinary moments, about choices made in desperation, and love tested by hard truth, they come out every single week. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and drop a like if you're already feeling this story. And in the comments, tell me the name of your city or your country. I want to know how far this story has traveled. It means more than you know. Now, let's go back to that platform in Millhaven, Wyoming, in the bitter tail end of March 1881, and let's find out exactly what kind of man Garrett Boone really was. Eliza Mercer was 31 years old, and she was not naive. She had spent 8 years teaching school in Roanoke County, Virginia, which meant she had spent 8 years managing rooms full of children who lied to her face and expected her not to notice. She had learned early that people reveal themselves not in what they say, but in what they leave out. A child who explained too much was hiding something. A child who went very quiet when asked a direct question was hiding something worse. She had applied that same logic to the letters. Garrett Boone had written to her through a plate agency in Richmond, the kind of service that matched educated women from the East with established men in the territories who needed practical wives, not decorative ones. His first letter had been brief and almost blunt. He was 36. He ran a cattle operation in Wyoming. He needed a woman who could manage accounts and correspondence, and who was not afraid of hard weather. He had not mentioned romance. He had not promised luxury. He had listed what he needed the way a man lists tools. She had respected that. She had written back in the same register. She was a school teacher. She understood accounts and record keeping. She was not fragile. She had no family left to return to in Virginia, and she would not come to Wyoming if the arrangement was merely a transaction dressed up as something warmer. He had written back, fair enough. Neither would I. That exchange had been the beginning. Over 6 months, the letters had become something she hadn't expected. They were still practical. He described the ranch's seasonal rhythms. She described teaching methods she thought would apply to ranch management. They debated cattle pricing and weather patterns and the reliability of Wyoming supply lines. But underneath all of that, something else had been building. Something she had not named even to herself because naming it felt dangerous. She had come to Wyoming because of those letters. She had not come for the cattle or the land or the security, though all of those things were real, and she was not a fool. She had come because the man in those letters had seemed, over 6 months of careful correspondence, like someone worth taking a risk for. Now she was standing on a train platform in the cold, looking at two men who wore the same hat and shared the same jawline, and were both watching her with expressions she could not yet read, and she felt the first true chill of that March morning go all the way through her. "Miss Mercer," said the taller one on the left. His voice was low and deliberate. "I'm Garrett." Before Eliza could respond, the second man on the right cleared his throat. "He's right," the second man said. "He's Garrett." A pause that stretched just a half-second too long. "I'm Silas, his brother." The word brother landed in the space between all three of them like a piece of furniture no one had planned for. Eliza looked at Silas Boone, then she looked back at Garrett Boone. You have a brother, she said. It was not a question. Garrett did not flinch, but something behind his eyes moved. I do. You never mentioned him. Another pause. The wind off the mountain cut across the platform, lifted a thin curl of steam from somewhere under the train. Garrett's jaw tightened. No, he said. I didn't. That was the moment Eliza understood she had not arrived at the life she had been promised. She had arrived at the edge of something she hadn't been allowed to see clearly, and the man responsible for that omission was standing 4 feet in front of her, looking her directly in the eye and offering her nothing except the stubborn truth that yes, he had kept something from her, and no, he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. She picked up her carpet bag. All right, she said. I'll need to see the ranch. The wagon ride out of Millhaven took 2 hours, and it was the most uncomfortable 2 hours of Eliza's adult life, not because of the road, which was rough but manageable, but because of the seating arrangement. Garrett drove. Silas sat in the back with her luggage and a canvas sack of hardware he'd apparently picked up in town. Eliza sat beside Garrett on the bench, close enough to feel the warmth coming off his coat, and said nothing for the first 30 minutes. Garrett said nothing either. Silas in the back did not seem to notice the silence. He made several observations about the weather, commented on the state of the North Road, and at one point identified a hawk circling above a ridge by its species, which no one had asked him to do. Eliza studied the landscape because it gave her something to look at while she collected herself. Wyoming was nothing like she had imagined. The scale of it, the way the land simply kept going in every direction, without any of Virginia's familiar softness, was something the letters hadn't conveyed, and perhaps couldn't. The mountains sat at the edge of the world like a wall. The sky was enormous and pale and indifferent. The grass was still winter gray, pressed flat by cold, and the wind moved across it in long visible waves. It was not beautiful in any way she had been taught to recognize beauty, but it was undeniably real. Everything here felt real, in a way that made Virginia feel, suddenly, like a painting she had been living inside. How long has he been here? She finally asked. Garrett kept his eyes on the road. 3 weeks. And before that, Colorado. He had a homestead there. A beat. He lost it. Eliza absorbed that. The debt collectors in your last letter, she said. The ones you mentioned had come through Millhaven, collecting for a Colorado outfit. Garrett's hands tightened on the reins. She had not expected him to be surprised that she'd made the connection, and he wasn't. He let out a slow breath. That's right. They weren't passing through, she said. No, he admitted. They were looking for Silas. From the back of the wagon, Silas had gone quiet. Either he was listening, or he had the very good sense to pretend he wasn't. Eliza looked straight ahead at the gray road. How much? She asked. I don't see how that's... How much does he owe? Garrett's jaw set. Then $460. The number sat between them in the cold air. $460 was, by Eliza's rapid calculation, approximately what she would have earned in 2.5 years of teaching school in Virginia. It was not a trivial sum. It was the kind of debt that could swallow a ranch's margin for an entire season if handled wrong. And the 60-day deadline, she said. That's real. This time, Garrett turned to look at her just briefly, just long enough for her to see that the steadiness in his face was costing him something. Yes, he said. It's real. She nodded once and returned her eyes to the road. All right, she said again. Tell me about the ranch's current accounts. The ranch was called the Boone Cross Spread, named for a water crossing on the southern edge of the property that Garrett's father had used as the boundary marker when he filed the original claim in 1863. Garrett had inherited it at 22 after his father died of a chest infection the winter following a bad cattle season. He had spent 14 years rebuilding what that bad season had taken, and the spread now ran 300 head of cattle across nearly 2,000 acres of leased and deeded land. It was, by most measurements, a solid operation. Not wealthy, but solvent. Kind of ranch that could survive a bad year if the bad year was only one. Eliza walked every part of it she could reach in the first 3 days. She was not trying to prove anything. She was genuinely trying to understand what she had arrived into, and the only way she knew how to understand something was to look at it directly and take careful notes. She asked Garrett where the account ledgers were kept. She asked to see the boundary record. She asked about the well situation in the hay storage and the current price per head at the Mill Haven stockyard. Garrett answered every question. He didn't appear to enjoy being questioned. There was a stiffness in him around it, the particular stiffness of a man who had made every decision alone for a very long time and found the process of explaining those decisions mildly uncomfortable. But he answered. That mattered to her. The ranch hand, a compact, weather-hardened man named Dolph, who had worked the spread for 11 years, watched Eliza's inspection with the expression of a man who has seen new arrangements come and is reserving judgment. He was not unfriendly. He was not particularly friendly either. He answered her questions about the cattle rotation with the short, accurate efficiency of someone who has spent years communicating with people who don't have time for long answers. She liked him immediately. Silas, meanwhile, had thrown himself into the work with the energy of someone trying to outrun something. He was up before dawn every morning and still working when the light failed. He fixed the broken hinge on the south pasture gate. He restrung the fence line along the creek bed that Dolph had been meaning to get to since October. He did everything asked of him and several things that weren't, and he did all of it without complaint, which Eliza found both admirable and slightly heartbreaking, because she recognized the shape of a man working to silence his own conscience. On the fourth evening, she found Garrett sitting at the kitchen table with the account ledger open in front of him, staring at numbers that weren't adding up the way he needed them to. She sat down across from him without asking. He looked up. "You found the boundary error," she said. He blinked. "You looked at the survey record." "I always look at the survey record." She turned the ledger slightly toward her. "East pasture line is marked 300 yards inside your actual claim. Someone filed the record wrong. Possibly when your father originally claimed the land. The grazing you've been losing to Harlan Price's cattle on that eastern edge, it's on your land." Garrett stared at her. "That's been going on for years," he said slowly. "At least 6, based on the way the grass has been cropped on that section," she said. "I walked it this morning." The silence between them now was different from the silence in the wagon. That silence had been defensive. This one was something else, a man recalibrating the dimensions of a problem he'd been carrying alone and suddenly realizing he didn't have to. "I'll need to file a corrected boundary record," she continued. "That requires a surveyor and a letter to the county land office. But if the correction goes through, you gain grazing land. That matters against the 60-day debt clock." Garrett set down his pencil. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "Who taught you all this?" Eliza almost smiled. "Almost. 8 years of managing a school's books on a county budget that was always 3 months late," she said. "You learned to find the margins." He looked at her for a moment in a way she didn't entirely know how to categorize, not appreciation exactly, more like a man revising an assumption he hadn't realized he was making. "I'll send for the surveyor," he said. She found Silas at the creek at dusk on the 5th evening. He was sitting on a flat rock, not doing anything in particular, which was so unusual for him by that point that she stopped when she saw him. He heard her coming and didn't turn around, which meant he'd decided she was going to see him whether he turned or not, and he'd rather not look like he was startled. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Boone," she said, because she hadn't yet decided what to call him. She sat on a different rock nearby. The creek was still running low from winter, a thin sound in the fading light. "I'm sorry you're caught in this," he said after a while. He said it the way someone says something they've been rehearsing, which meant he meant it. "I'm not caught," she said. He turned to look at her. He had the same broad face as Garrett, the same set to the jaw, but where Garrett's eyes were careful and measured, Silas's were more open and currently more miserable. "You came out here expecting one thing and got something entirely different. That's a reasonable description of most of life," she said. He looked at her for a moment. You're not angry. Didn't say that. He turned back to the creek. A muscle in his jaw shifted. Garrett should have told you. About me. About the debt. About all of it. Yes, she said. He should have. He was scared you wouldn't come. The admission landed quietly. Silas hadn't dressed it up or apologized for it. He'd just said it. The way you say something true when you're tired of protecting other people's pride with careful language. Eliza looked at the water. He should have trusted me with the truth, she said, and given me the chance to decide anyway. Silas was quiet for a moment. You have? Come, I mean. If you'd known? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The honest answer was that she didn't know, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise for the sake of comfort. I don't know, she said, but that's not the point. Point is, he didn't let me choose. Silas nodded slowly, like a man absorbing something he already half knew. He's not a dishonest man, Silas said. I know that, Eliza said. That's actually the most frustrating part. She was not built for easy comfort, and she knew it. Virginia had never felt like home, not really. Not the way people in novels describe home, that bone-deep belonging. She had been born there, had lived there, had taught there, had buried both her parents there. And when the last of them was gone, she had stayed mostly because leaving felt like acknowledging that there was nothing to leave for. The letters had changed that calculation. Now here she was in Wyoming, in a ranch house that smelled like pine smoke and old leather and cold coming in under the back door, with a man she had come to care about from 6 months of paper and ink, a brother-in-law she hadn't been told existed, debt that threatened to pull the whole structure down, and a boundary error that might be the first thread of a solution if she could pull it without unraveling something else. She had not come this far to turn back. That was not who she was, and she had known it since she was 12 years old and refused to cry in front of the teacher who told her she was too clever for her own good. But she was clear-eyed enough to know the next 60 days were going to test every one of them. She sat at the kitchen table after supper when Garrett and Silas had both gone to their corners of the house, and she opened the account ledger again, and she worked by lamplight until the numbers stopped moving and the margins became something she could hold on to. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved against the walls of the house, steady and indifferent as it had always been and would always be. Inside, Eliza Mercer did what she had always done when the situation in front of her was harder than it had any right to be. She got to work. The surveyor came on a Tuesday. His name was Aldous Frick, a thin man in his 50s with a methodical way of moving and the faint permanent squint of someone who had spent decades looking at land through measuring equipment. He arrived on horseback with a canvas satchel full of instruments and the particular professional detachment of a man hired to measure the earth, not to have opinions about who owned it. Eliza had written the letter requesting his services herself, on Garrett's stationery, in a clear hand that left no room for ambiguity about what she needed and when she needed it. She had also included a sketch of the eastern boundary discrepancy she had identified from the original survey record, which Aldous Frick studied for 3 long minutes before looking up at her with the expression of a man recalibrating his expectations for the meeting. You drew this yourself? He asked. I did, she said. He looked at it again. You've surveyed before? I've read survey records, she said. There's a difference, but the mathematics translate. Frick folded the sketch carefully and put it in his satchel. I'll walk the line this afternoon, he said. Weather permitting. The weather will permit, Eliza said, because she had been watching the sky since 4 that morning and she knew it would hold. Garrett, standing beside her, said nothing. He had said very little that morning. He had the look of a man watching someone else navigate his own property and finding the experience strange, not unpleasant, exactly, but disorienting in a way he didn't yet know how to name. Dolph took Frick out to the east pasture after noon. Silas was already there, working the fence line, and Eliza watched from the yard as the 3 figures moved across the gray-gold grass until they were too small to read clearly. She went back inside and returned to the accounts. The numbers were not desperate, not yet, But they were tight in the particular way that ranch finances got tight when one unexpected obligation landed on top of a season's carefully managed margins. Cattle prices at the Millhaven stockyard were holding steady, which helped. The hay stores were adequate through spring, which helped more. $460 in 60 days, layered over the regular costs of running a 300-head operation with one ranch hand, and now one additional mouth. It required precision, required the kind of thinking that left no slack. She was deep in the third column of figures when she heard the horses. Not one horse. Two, coming fast up the road from town, which was not how people came to visit, and was not how supply deliveries arrived, and was almost certainly the sound of something she would have to deal with before the afternoon was finished. She set down her pencil and went to the window. Two men on dark horses pulled up in the yard with the ease of people who are used to arriving places and being in charge of what happens after. They were not dressed like cowboys. They were dressed like men who worked in offices but rode when the work required it. Good coats, clean boots, the kind of hat that said I earn money from other people's mistakes. One of them was heavy-set with a short red beard. The other was taller, narrower, with the patient stillness of someone who has learned that patience is more effective than aggression at collecting what people owe. Eliza recognized the type before either of them said a word. She had seen debt agents in Virginia, the men who came to the school board when the county ran behind on payments, who sat in the back of the room and wrote things down, and spoke in the quiet, measured tones of people who don't need to raise their voices, because the paperwork already says everything. She went to the front door and opened it before they could knock. The heavy-set one with the red beard looked at her with mild surprise. "Ma'am, we're looking for Garrett Boone. He's out on the property," she said. "What is this regarding?" The taller one spoke. His name, she would learn, was Caldwell. "We represent Meridian Lending out of Denver. We have an outstanding obligation connected to this address." He produced a folded document from inside his coat with the practiced ease of a man who produces documents for a living. "If you could tell us when Mr. Boone is expected back." "I can tell you that he'll be back before dark," Eliza said. "And I can also tell you that I'm aware of the obligation you're referencing, the principal amount, and the deadline. So if you've come to confirm those details, I can confirm them for you right now. If you've come to renegotiate terms, you'll need to speak with Mr. Boone directly." She paused, "And you might as well water your horses while you wait." Caldwell looked at her for a moment. Then he almost smiled, not warmly, but with the recognition of someone who has run into a variable he hadn't accounted for. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said. Garrett came back from the east pasture an hour later, with Dolph and Aldous Frink trailing behind him, and the expression of a man who has just been told something that is partly good news and partly complicated. He saw the two horses at the trough, and his face shifted into the particular stillness he wore when he was managing something difficult. He came inside first. "Frick confirms the boundary error," he said to Eliza, keeping his voice down. "The east line is 312 yards inside the actual claim. He's going to file the correction with the county office." "Good," she said. "The Meridian men are outside. I can see that. They're polite. The tall one's name is Caldwell. He's the one who talks." Garrett set his hat on the hook by the door. He ran one hand back through his hair, the gesture of a man pressing down something he doesn't want visible, and then straightened and looked at her. "What did you tell them?" "That we know the amount and the deadline," she said, "and that you'd speak with them when you got back." Studied her for a moment. "You said we." "I said we," she confirmed. Something moved across his face that she didn't examine too closely. Then he nodded once and went back outside. She followed at a distance that was respectful but close enough to hear. Garrett shook Caldwell's hand with the grip of a man who is not going to perform either panic or false confidence. "You've had a long ride from town," he said. "I appreciate you coming out directly." "That's the job," Caldwell said. He opened his coat and produced the document again. "Mr. Boone, you'll see the terms here. $460. 60-day deadline runs from the 1st of March. That puts us at the end of April. We're here to confirm the obligation is understood and to discuss your intention. Garrett took the document. He read it, the way she had learned. He read everything deliberately, completely, without rushing. Then he handed it back. The obligation is understood, he said. My brother incurred it on a Colorado venture that didn't produce. He's working my spread now to settle it. Caldwell's eyes moved briefly to the barn, as if calculating whether Silas was in there. And the amount? Can you confirm your brother intends to satisfy it in full before the deadline? He intends to, Garrett said. With respect, Mr. Boone, intention and payment are different instruments. They are, Garrett agreed. He did not raise his voice. He did not step back. I expect to have the first payment to you in 30 days. The balance within 60. I'm not asking you to renegotiate, and I'm not asking for an extension. I'm telling you what's going to happen. Caldwell looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Eliza, who was standing near the porch steps with her arms at her sides, and then he looked back at Garrett. We'll be back in 30 days, he said. I'll have payment ready, Garrett said. The two men mounted and rode out of the yard at a measured pace, neither hurrying nor lingering. When they reached the road and turned toward town, Eliza let out a breath she had not entirely realized she was holding. Dolph, who had watched the entire exchange from near the barn without expression, spat in the dirt and went back to work. Silas came in from the fence line at dusk with dirt on his knees and a cut on his right hand he hadn't mentioned to anyone. Eliza saw it when he reached for the water pitcher at supper, a clean slice across the base of 2 fingers that had bled and dried, and was now just an angry red line he was apparently treating with the frontier approach of ignoring it entirely. Give me your hand, she said. He looked at her. The cut, she said. Let me look at it. It's nothing. It's open, and you've been handling fence wire with it all afternoon, she said. Give me your hand, Mr. Boone. He gave her his hand with the reluctant obedience of a man who knows he's being unreasonable and can't quite explain why. She cleaned it with the carbolic solution from the medicine shelf and wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth, working efficiently and without ceremony. He sat still and didn't make any noise about it, which she noted. Garrett watched from across the table without comment. The Meridian men were here, Silas said, after she had tied off the bandage. I know, she said. I spoke with them. He looked at her. He stopped. What did you say? I told them we knew the amount and the deadline. Garrett handled the rest. Silas was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly, more like the complicated feeling of a man who has been bracing for punishment and finds, instead, that people are simply continuing to try to solve the problem. I should have told Garrett the full amount before I came, he said. He wasn't looking at either of them when he said it. He was looking at the table, at a knothole in the wood that gave him something neutral to address. I told him most of it, not all of it. I kept thinking I could cover the gap myself before he had to know. Why didn't you? Garrett said. The question was quiet, which made it heavier. Silas turned the wrapped hand over on the table slowly, studying it. Because I already knew what your face would look like when I told you, he said, and I'd rather have done anything else than see that. The silence in the kitchen had a particular texture to it, the kind that happens when something true has been said out loud that everyone in the room had already half known and was waiting for someone else to name. Garrett looked at his brother for a long moment. Then he looked down at the ledger. Eliza had left open on the table's edge. The surveyor found the boundary error, he said. 300 yards of east pasture that's been grazed by Price's cattle that was ours all along. Once the correction is filed, we take it back. Silas looked up. That's your land? It was always our land, Garrett said. We just didn't know we were losing it. Correction took 2 weeks to process through the county office. Eliza had written the accompanying letter herself clear, exact, with the survey measurements attached, and a formal request for the corrected record to be posted before the end of April. She had also written a separate letter to Harlan Price, the neighboring rancher whose cattle had been crossing the incorrect boundary for years, informing him of the correction in plain, factual language that left no room for a dispute about whether he had been notified. Price rode over 3 days after the letter arrived. He was a big man in his 60s with the confident manner of someone who has owned land long enough to feel that ownership is a personality trait. He pulled up in the yard on a gray quarter horse and looked down at Eliza from the saddle with an expression that was not quite hostile, but was built on the assumption that she was going to be easier to deal with than Garrett. He had evidently not been told that Garrett had a mail-order bride who had caught a survey error that had been costing the ranch for 6 years. "I'd like to speak with Boone," he said. "He's moving cattle on the south pasture," Eliza said. "I'm his wife. What can I do for you, Mr. Price?" Price looked at her for a moment, then decided to proceed. "This letter's about the boundary," he said. "There's been an agreement. There's been an error," she said. "Mr. Frick's corrected survey has already been filed with the county. The record is legal and on file. The east pasture boundary is where it was always supposed to be." Price shifted in the saddle. "My cattle have been running that section for years, on land that belongs to the Boone Cross spread," she said. "I understand it wasn't intentional. The original filing error was made before either of us was involved. But the correction has been made, and it stands." She paused. "Your cattle are welcome to be moved off that section at your convenience. We'd prefer before the end of the week, but we recognize it takes time to move livestock." Price looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is angry but cannot find the specific argument he needs. "You know this'll cause bad blood between the properties," he said. "It doesn't have to," Eliza said. "You were running your cattle on what you believed was open range. Now you know it isn't. That's a misunderstanding, not a grievance. I'd prefer we treat it as such." He stared at her for another moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward the road without another word. Eliza watched him go with her hands clasped in front of her. Dolph appeared from somewhere behind her. "That went better than I expected," he said. "He'll be fine," she said. "Men like that are mostly upset about being surprised. Once he's had a few days to adjust to the new fact, he'll file it away." Dolph squinted at the retreating figure on the road. "You've handled that kind before." "School boards," she said. "Same thing. Different hat." The 30-day mark came on a Friday. In the 2 weeks since the Meridian men had ridden away, the ranch had operated in a state of controlled urgency that Eliza found exhausting in a way that was also, she recognized, oddly clarifying. There was something about a real deadline, a specific, documented, legally binding deadline, that removed every optional thing and left only what actually mattered. She slept less. She worked earlier and later. She stopped thinking about Virginia entirely, which surprised her until she realized it had been weeks since she'd thought about it anyway. Garrett moved cattle to the Millhaven stockyard on the Wednesday before the deadline. 14 head from the west pasture animals he had planned to hold until late spring, but had moved up on Eliza's recommendation that the current market price was close to its seasonal peak and would likely dip again before April. The sale came in at $212. It was not the full debt. It was not supposed to be. It was the first payment Garrett had promised Caldwell, and it left $248 remaining on a 30-day clock that had just reset. Silas had worked every day of those 30 days without exception. He rose before Dolph and quit after dark, and had driven every fence post on the north line and rebuilt the rotting section of the east corral gate, and mucked every stall and repaired the pump housing on the south well, and done approximately the work of a man and a half every day for 4 straight weeks. Garrett paid him the standard ranch hand wage, which Silas took without argument and added to a tin box he kept under his bunk in the back room. When Garrett returned from the stockyard with the payment receipt, Silas came in from the barn and sat down at the kitchen table with the tin box. He opened it and counted out what was inside. Eliza watched from the stove. The total in the tin was $61.40. Combined with the stockyard payment, they were at $273.40, so against a remaining balance of $248. Meant they were close almost exactly at the number they needed, but close required a cattle and a month of wages, and every margin Eliza had found in the accounts over the past 30 days. And there was still the matter of the Colorado cattle. Colorado herd, she said. Silas looked up. You mentioned in the first week that there were still head registered under your name in Colorado, she said. Animals you hadn't been able to move when the homestead failed. Silas rubbed his jaw. The cut on his hand had healed to a faint pink line. 7 head. They're being held by a man named Cutter outside Pueblo. He took them in when I left, said he'd hold them till I could arrange sale or transport. Can you write to him? I can, Silas said slowly. But getting them sold and the payment wired in 30 days. Write the letter tonight, Eliza said. I'll look up the wire transfer office hours in Millhaven. If you can get a reply from Cutter within 2 weeks, you'll have time. Silas looked at her with an expression she had come to recognize, not gratitude exactly, because gratitude felt too simple for what it was. It was the look of a man who has been underwater long enough to stop expecting air and has suddenly been pointed toward the surface. You didn't have to do any of this, he said. No, she said. Didn't. She turned back to the stove. Write the letter. Garrett found her on the porch that evening. The nights had begun to ease just barely, just at the edges out of the deep winter cold, and into something that still bit but no longer punished. She was sitting in the straight-backed chair with a shawl and a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm, watching the sky go dark from the west in the slow, deliberate way Wyoming skies did everything. He sat down on the step below her without asking, which she noted. Asking would have been correct form. Not asking meant something different, a small decision to stop being formal about distance. Frick sent the final corrected record today, he said. Official, the east pasture is ours. Good, she said. The wind moved through the grass in the near dark. Somewhere north of the barn, a nighthawk made its single descending call and went quiet. The Price cattle are off the east section, Garrett said. His hands moved them 2 days ago, I noticed. Dolph says the grass on that section is better than it looks from the fence line. Once we rotate cattle through it in spring, it should produce. He was quiet for a moment. That's because of you. Eliza looked at the darkening sky. Because of a survey error in basic mathematics, she said. That's not what I mean. She knew what he meant. She wasn't entirely sure she wanted to have the conversation right then, not because she was unwilling, but because she understood that some things said before, their time, have to be unsaid later, and that's rarely comfortable. Garrett, she said. I know, he said. They sat in silence for a moment. The nighthawk called again from farther away. Why didn't you tell me about Silas? She said. Not an accusation. Just the question, set down plainly between them, like the thing it was. He didn't answer immediately. He picked at something on the knee of his trousers, a thread, or a dried bit of grass, and then stopped. I started the letter 3 times, he said, after he showed up. Once before you'd even booked the train. He paused. I couldn't figure out how to say it without it, sounding like the arrangement was already broken. Wasn't broken, she said. I know that now. You knew it then too, she said. You just didn't trust me to know it with you. He looked at his hands. She watched his profile, the straight nose, the jaw she had somehow already memorized, the way he held himself very still when he was working through something true. No, he said finally. I didn't, and that was wrong. The admission sat between them in the cooling air. Eliza considered it not whether she believed him, because she did, but what she was going to do with it. She had come 1,200 miles from Virginia to a man she'd only ever met on paper, and the man was proving to be simultaneously better and more difficult than the paper version in the ways that mattered, which was probably the most accurate outcome she could have hoped for. Silas is writing to Cutter tonight, she said. About the Colorado cattle. Garrett nodded. I heard. Another pause. You thought of that. He thought of it too. He mentioned the cattle in the first week. He just needed someone to push toward the solution instead of around it. Garrett turned to look at her, fully then, not the brief calibrating glances he had been giving her since she arrived, but a direct look that had no managing in it. You are not what I expected, he said. She almost said, neither are you. But the honest version was more complicated than that. He was, in many ways, exactly what she had expected from the letters: steady, careful, slower to warmth than some people, but real when it came. What she hadn't expected was how much that steadiness, in person, in a hard situation, would feel like something worth standing beside. "What did you expect?" she asked. He thought about it. "Someone competent," he said. "Someone practical. And someone who'd be satisfied with this." His hand moved, indicating the ranch, the land, the general arrangement of things. "Someone who'd fit in and not—" He stopped. "Not what?" "Not make the problems bigger by looking at them," he said. "I didn't know looking at them would make them smaller." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she stood, picking up her lukewarm tea. "The 60 days aren't up yet," she said, "and Silas still needs to hear from Cutter." Garrett looked up at her. "We have time to worry about what you expected later," she said. "Right now there's still work." She went inside. She heard him, a few minutes later, come in behind her and go to his desk in the front room. She heard the scratch of a pen, not hers. Not the account ledger, but his personal correspondence paper. She did not ask what he was writing. She had the sense it was something he had been trying to write for a while. Cutter's reply came in 11 days. The letter was short and businesslike, a Colorado rancher's letter, efficient with words, and said that the 7 head were sound, that he could sell them locally for a reasonable price, that he would wire the proceeds to the Millhaven Telegraph office upon sale. He expected to have a buyer within the week. Silas read the letter at the breakfast table and set it down without speaking for a long moment. Then he said, "It's going to be enough." Garrett looked at him. Silas ran the numbers aloud: cattle sale, wages saved, partial payment already delivered, expected wire amount from Cutter. When he finished, the total cleared the remaining balance by $14. Not by hundreds, by $14. Liza set down her coffee cup. "Then you need Cutter's sale to go through clean," she said. "No delays, no complications with the wire." "Cutter's reliable," Silas said. "He was the only man in Pueblo who didn't try to take advantage of me when the homestead failed." "Then you'd better write him back today," she said, "and confirm the wire address at the Millhaven office and ask him to send confirmation of sale as soon as it closes." Silas looked at her. Then he stood up from the table, picked up the letter, and went to find paper. Garrett watched him go. He and Eliza sat at the breakfast table with the remains of the meal between them. Outside, Dolph was already in the yard, the sound of his work, a steady background rhythm that had become, Eliza realized, one of the things about this place she had started to count on. "The wire comes through," Garrett said quietly, "and we make the final payment." "We will," she said. "You don't know that for certain." "No," she agreed. "But I know Silas has worked every day for 60 days and written the letter and done everything within his control. Sometimes that has to be enough to bet on." Garrett looked at her across the table. Outside the window, the sky was coming up pale and clear, the first genuinely warm morning they'd had, and the light came in at a low angle and lay across the table between them, in a way that made the whole kitchen feel briefly like something other than a working space. "Where did you learn to think like this?" he said. Picked up her coffee cup. "I told you, 8 years of county school budgets. It's not what I mean." She looked at him. "I know," she said. She didn't answer the real question. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the honest version was something she wasn't ready to hand over yet, that she had spent most of her adult life in a small town that treated her intelligence as a curiosity at best and an inconvenience at worst. The letters had been the first time in years someone had engaged her as a full person rather than a useful oddity, and that what had made her get on the train wasn't the security or the land or even Garrett himself. It was the possibility of being somewhere she could think clearly and have it matter. That was the thing she had come 1,200 miles for, and despite the debt and the brother and the 60 days and Harlan Price and his cattle and the survey error and every complication she had not been told about before she boarded the train, despite all of it, she was beginning to think she had not miscalculated. The wire from Cutter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, 8 days before the deadline. Silas picked it up from the telegraph office in Millhaven and rode back to the ranch faster than he'd ridden anywhere since he'd lost the Colorado homestead. He came through the front door with the telegram in his hand and his hat still on his head, something she had never once seen him do inside the house, and held it out to Garrett without a word. Garrett read it. $206. Sale closed. Wire transferred. He set the telegram down on the table. He looked at Silas. And Silas, who had spent 60 days working harder than Eliza had ever seen a man work without complaint or performance, who had eaten at their table and slept in their spare room, and sewn up his own cut hand and moved cattle in the dark, and said sorry in the particular way that men say it when they mean it badly enough to actually change. Silas looked back at his brother, and something passed between them that had no words and needed none. Garrett put his hand on his brother's shoulder. Just that. Silas looked at the floor. Eliza stood near the kitchen doorway and watched and did not say anything, because there are moments that belong entirely to the people in them. And her job right now was not to be part of it, but to have helped make it possible. Outside, the April wind moved through the east pasture, their east pasture now, legally, officially, every yard of it, and the grass was beginning to green at last, along the creek bed, slow and stubborn, as everything in Wyoming, coming up in its own time, on its own terms, asking no one's permission. Payment to Meridian went out on Monday with 8 days to spare. Caldwell sent a receipt by return post. No note, no commentary, just the receipt, stamped and dated, which was the only language that conversation had ever required. Silas stood at the table with the receipt in his hand for a long moment after it arrived. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his breast pocket, and went back out to work. The receipt from Meridian changed things not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself, but in the quiet, structural way that a removed weight changes the way a person stands. The debt was gone. The 60 days were over. The ranch was still intact. What remained was everything that the debt had been sitting on top of. Silas was the first to feel it. In the days after the payment cleared, the relentless early morning urgency that had defined his weeks on the ranch began to ease, not disappear, but settle into something more sustainable. He still worked hard. He was constitutionally incapable of not working hard. Quality of his movement changed. He stopped looking at the road each afternoon around the time a rider from town might plausibly arrive. He stopped eating, with one shoulder angled toward the door. He was still a man who had lost his homestead and arrived at his brother's ranch carrying failure. That hadn't changed. But the specific, documented, interest-accruing version of the failure was finished, and what was left was something older and harder to name, the kind of thing a man carries, not in his wallet, but somewhere lower, somewhere that receipts don't reach. Garrett noticed. He didn't say anything about it directly, because Garrett's preferred method of addressing emotional reality was to work alongside it until the work itself created an opening. He began including Silas more deliberately in the decisions, not large decisions, not yet, but the kind of daily ranch consultations that signal trust, which pasture to rotate first in spring, whether to repair the south well pump now or wait until summer, what price to hold out for at the next stockyard run. Silas answered these questions carefully, the way someone answers when they know they're being given something back and don't want to mishandle it. Eliza watched all of this and said nothing, which was its own form of participation. She had her own adjustment to make. The 60 days had given her a specific, structured purpose from the moment she arrived: find the margins, correct the boundary, help Silas clear the debt, keep the ranch from sliding into crisis. That purpose had organized every day and made the strangeness of her situation a new place, a new arrangement, a man she was still learning in person, what she had only known on paper manageable, because there was always something concrete to do next. Now the concrete problem was gone, and what remained was the actual question of what her life here was going to be. She sat with that question on a Tuesday morning in the second week of May at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the ranch account ledger open in front of her, and she recognized that she had been keeping the ledger current out of habit for the past week without anyone asking her to, without anyone actually needing it updated in the particular urgent way it had been needed before. She was still here. She was still doing the work. But the reason she'd told herself she was doing it had quietly expired, and she hadn't yet found the next one. Garrett came in from the barn and poured himself coffee and looked at the open ledger. He sat down across from her. "You're updating the spring projections," he said. "I am," she said. "I didn't ask you to." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "Is that something you want to keep doing?" The question was genuine, not a test, not a leading question with a preferred answer waiting at the end. Just Garrett asking something he actually wanted to know, which was, she had learned, how he asked everything. She looked at the ledger. The columns were neat, the figures current, the projected margin for the spring cattle season laid out in a way that made the ranch's options clear at a glance. She had made it that way. She had also made it in a way that could be maintained, not just read by her, but understood by anyone who sat down with it. "Yes," she said. "I want to keep doing it." "Then it's yours," he said. "If you want it." It was possibly the least romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. It was also, she thought, probably the most accurate indicator of who Garrett Boone actually was, a man who expressed regard through practical delegation, who showed trust by handing you the thing that mattered most. "East pasture," she said. "When are you rotating cattle through?" 2 weeks, he said. "Maybe less if the grass keeps coming in the way it has." "The east section is going to be your best producer this season," she said. "I'd push toward the shorter timeline. Let it work for you." He nodded slowly. "I had the same thought." They sat for a moment with their coffee, and outside the window, the Wyoming spring was doing what Wyoming spring did, moving fast and uncertain, warm one day and bitter the next. Sky changing its mind every few hours, with a conviction that made Virginia's seasons feel apologetic by comparison. It was not comfortable exactly, but she was no longer flinching at it. The trouble with Harlan Price did not arrive the way Eliza expected it. She had expected more resistance about the boundary correction, a formal complaint filed with the county, a letter from a lawyer, the kind of paperwork that a man with land and pride generates when he feels wronged, even if the wrong is a misunderstanding. She had prepared for that. She had kept copies of everything Aldous Frick had filed, organized in a folder. She kept in the top drawer of the kitchen desk. What came instead was a conversation at the Millhaven General Store on a Thursday in mid-May. She had ridden into town for supplies a list Garrett had written, plus 3 items she had added without discussion because they were needed and nobody else was going to think of them. The store was run by a man named Abe Hooper, who had lived in Millhaven for 20 years and consequently knew everything about everyone in a radius of 40 miles and had the discretion to share exactly as much as served his purposes at any given moment. She was at the counter, waiting for Hooper to work through the list when she heard Price's voice from the back of where the hardware section met the dry goods. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to another man, a rancher named Stills, from the property north of the creek, a man she recognized by face but hadn't spoken to directly. Their voices were not loud, but the store was small enough and quiet enough that she could hear them without trying. "Can't figure why Boone brought her out here," Price was saying. "Ranch hand wife from Virginia, making land claims, running correspondence like she's got a surveyor in her pocket." "She found the boundary error," Stills said. He sounded neutral, not particularly invested. "Convenient timing," Price said. 60-day debt clock running, and suddenly there's a survey correction that gives them east pasture back. I've been running that section for 6 years, and nobody said a word." "Boone didn't know," Stills said. "Boone didn't look," Price said, "and now she's looked, and suddenly everybody knows. And I've got to move 24 cattle off range I've been maintaining since his father let it go fallow." He paused. "I'm just saying there's a pattern when a woman like that comes out of nowhere and starts finding things that change the property lines." Eliza set down the supply list on the counter very carefully, turned around. Price was at the back of the store with his back half turned, not looking at her. Stills was facing her direction and had clearly seen her the moment she turned because his expression went immediately uncomfortable with the particular discomfort of a man who realizes a private conversation has had an audience. "Mr. Price," she said. Price turned. He was not a man who startled easily. He didn't startle now. But something moved through his expression, not embarrassment exactly. More, the recalibration of a man who has been caught saying something he would have been willing to defend if asked, but had preferred to say without being heard. "Mrs. Boone," he said. "I heard what you said," she told him. Kept her voice level. "I'd like to address it." Price tilted his chin. "You're welcome to. I didn't come to Wyoming looking for a survey error," she said. "I came to marry a rancher and to be useful on his property. And being useful on a ranch requires reading the records, which is what I did." The correction was a legal one, filed by a licensed surveyor. It wasn't convenient timing. It was routine due diligence. Price looked at her. 6 years of routine due diligence that nobody did until you showed up, he said. "Yes," she said, "that's right, because nobody looked." She paused. "I'm sorry about the cattle inconvenience, Mr. Price. I said that when I wrote you. I meant it. But the land is the land, and the record is correct, and I'd prefer we continue as neighbors who've sorted out a misunderstanding rather than neighbors who've made it into something else." The store was very quiet. Hooper had gone still behind the counter with his hand on the flour sack. Price looked at her for a moment that ran one beat too long. Then he said, "I don't have a quarrel with you, Mrs. Boone." "Good," she said. "Then we're agreed." She turned back to the counter. Her hands were steady, which she was aware of because she was checking. She finished the supply transaction with Hooper, who bagged everything with unusual speed and efficiency, and she loaded the wagon herself and drove back to the ranch without stopping. She told Garrett about the conversation that evening because she had decided before she left the store that she would tell him, that keeping it from him would be a version of the same mistake he'd made with her about Silas, and she was not willing to import that pattern into the marriage she was trying to build. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. The question surprised her. She had expected him to want to do something on his own ride over to Price's property, or write a letter, or make some move that put him back in the position of being the one who handled things. Instead, he was asking her. "Nothing yet?" she said. "Think I said what needed saying. If it becomes something more, I'll tell you." He nodded. "All right." She looked at him. "You're not going to argue about that?" "No," he said. She waited. "You handled it better than I would have," he said. It was not easy for him to say. She could hear that. He was a man who had managed this ranch alone for 14 years and had the habits that grow in that particular soil, the assumption that he was the one who solved problems, the slight internal resistance to the idea that someone else might solve them better. He was saying it anyway. She filed that away. Spring came to the Boone Cross spread with its usual mix of gifts and complications. East Pasture, opened up to the ranch's use for the first time in 6 years, was better than Eliza had projected from the boundary records. The grass was deep-rooted from years of limited grazing, the soil dark and rich along the creek margin. When Garrett rotated the first group of cattle through in late May, Dolph spent 2 days moving them and came back to report that the animals looked better after 3 days on the east section than they had after 2 weeks on the main pasture. "That's 6 years of growing," Dolph said at supper. He was not a man who made observations casually. "It'll thin once we run it regular. But right now, it's the best grass on the property." Garrett looked at Eliza. She did not say, "I told you so," picked up her fork, but she noted, privately, that the East Pasture's first season output was going to put the ranch's spring margin above anything she'd projected in even the most optimistic column, which meant the debt year, the year that was supposed to be the worst year the Boone Cross spreads had seen in a decade, was going to close as one of the better ones. It was almost funny, if you looked at it a certain way. Silas looked at it that way. You know, he said, one evening in late May, leaning back from the supper table, with a manner that was gradually becoming something she'd call relaxed. I came here with nothing but problems, and a debt Garrett didn't even know the full size of, and somehow the east pasture gets corrected, and the spring is the best season in years. He shook his head. It's a thing. It's a coincidence, Eliza said. Is it? Silas said. She looked at him. The boundary error was there before you came. The grass was growing before you came. The conditions that made this spring good had nothing to do with your arrival. No, Silas said. But your arrival did. He looked at her without any of the deflection he'd used in the first weeks. If Garrett hadn't written those letters, you wouldn't have come. If you hadn't come and looked at the records, nobody would have found the error. If nobody had found the error, this pasture would still be growing grass for Price's cattle, and Garrett's spring margin would be ordinary. He paused. I'm not saying it worked out because of me. I'm saying it worked out because of one thing after another that wouldn't have happened the same way without every piece being where it was. Garrett at the other end of the table was looking at the tablecloth. Eliza looked at Silas for a moment. It's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one, he said. She let it settle. She looked at Garrett. He looked up when he felt her looking, which was something she had noticed about him. He always felt it. He had a quality of attentiveness that his silence often concealed. He was aware of her in the room with a consistency that was not intrusive, but was always present, the way a good reader is aware of every word on the page without stopping on each one. He's not wrong, Garrett said quietly. She looked back at her plate. No, she said. He's not entirely wrong. The new trouble arrived on a Wednesday, in the first week of June. Eliza was in the front room updating the summer rotation schedule when a rider came up the road from town moving with a kind of pace that said message, not visit. She went to the door. It was a boy from Millhaven. She recognized the telegraph office boy, maybe 15, who made the delivery runs on a paint pony. He handed her a sealed envelope and waited. Inside the envelope was a letter from the county land office, not the routine acknowledgement of the corrected boundary she had already received. A new letter, dated 4 days prior, from a county land examiner named R. H. Polly. It was in careful bureaucratic language a notice of competing claim. Someone had filed a formal challenge to the corrected boundary record, arguing that the original 1,863 Boone filing contained a secondary error that the Frick survey had failed to account for specifically, that the northern edge of the claimed 2,000 acres had been marked from a reference point that no longer existed, meaning the entire legal description of the property was potentially in dispute, not just the east pasture line, the entire 2,000 acres. Eliza read the letter twice before she moved. Then she read it a third time, slowly, looking for the specific language that would tell her how serious this was. R. H. Polly was requesting a formal hearing before the county land board in 30 days. The letter did not name who had filed the competing claim. She paid the boy and went to find Garrett. He was in the barn with Dolph, working on the hitch assembly for the supply wagon, which had been developing a rattle that irritated Dolph to a degree slightly out of proportion to the actual mechanical problem. Garrett looked up when she came in. He read it. He read it the way she had twice, then a third time. Then he said a word she had not heard him use before, which told her more than the letter had about the severity of what they were looking at. Dolph, who had been handed the letter by Garrett without comment, read it, handed it back, and said nothing. Picked up the wrench and went back to the hitch. Who filed it? Garrett said. It doesn't say. It has to say somewhere. Not in this letter, she said. Possibly at the land office. I'd need to go in and look at the filing itself. Garrett set the letter down on the workbench, put both hands flat on the wood, and stood that way for a moment, which was something she had learned meant he was managing something large and needed a second to bring it to a manageable size. The 1,863 filing, she said, keeping her voice steady. Do you have your father's original paperwork? He looked up. Somewhere. There's a tin box in the back of the storage room with old documents. I need to look at it today, she said. He pushed off the workbench. I'll find it. The tin box had not been opened in years. Probably since Garrett's father died. It was the kind of box that accumulates rust at the hinges and resists being opened not through any physical mechanism, but through the particular reluctance people feel about archives of the dead papers that belong to someone who used them and are now just paper. Garrett opened it without ceremony. He set it on the kitchen table and stepped back. Eliza went through it carefully, piece by piece. There were letters, receipts, a photograph she set to one side without examining, a folded copy of the original homestead application, and at the bottom, thick with age, folds dark from decades of compression, the original 1,863 land claim filing. Folded it. It was handwritten, as all such documents were, in the hand of whoever had processed the filing at the Territorial Land Office in 18,863. The legal description was standard for the period, a method of boundary description that used natural landmarks and compass bearings from a fixed reference point. The reference point named in the filing was the Great Cottonwood at Boone's Crossing. Eliza looked at the document for a long moment. Then she looked up at Garrett. Cottonwood at Boone's Crossing, she said. The one the spread is named for. Garrett's expression shifted. It fell, he said slowly. 15 years ago. Lightning took it. Was 21. She looked back at the document. A boundary described from a reference point that no longer existed. That was the crack someone had found. That was what the competing claim was built on, the argument that without the original Cottonwood as a reference, the entire legal description of the property was unencored, meaning the boundaries could theoretically be redrawn. It was not necessarily a winning argument, but it was a real one. And in front of a county land board with the wrong examiner, a real argument could do real damage. Can a claim like this succeed? Garrett asked. She was quiet for a moment, arranging what she knew. It can cause enough uncertainty to freeze the property, she said. If the board takes it seriously, you can't legally sell. So subdivide or file new improvements against the title until the hearing resolves it. That's 30 days of paralysis at the start of summer. She paused. And if the board finds in favor of the challenger, they could reset the boundaries, Garrett said. Yes. He looked at the document. His face was doing the careful, controlled thing it did when something large was pressing against it. We need to know who filed it. I'm going to Millhaven tomorrow, she said. I'll look at the filing at the land office. The challenger's name will be on it. I'll go with you. You don't need to. I'm going with you, he said. There was something in his voice that was not argument. It was simply the way he said a thing when he had already decided it, when the decision wasn't open for discussion, not because he was closing the door, but because he was telling her where he was standing. She looked at him. All right, she said. Silas found out at supper. Garrett told him in the same direct, unembellished way. He told most things. Here is the situation. Here is what we know. Here is what we're doing tomorrow. Silas listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. He had a tendency toward response, toward filling silence with words that did useful things, even when those words were just acknowledgement. This time he said nothing until Garrett had finished. Then he said, "Its price." Garrett looked at him. "You don't know that." "No," Silas said. "But who else has a reason?" He counted on his fingers with the methodical air of someone working through logic they've run before. The boundary correction took East Pasture away from him. He's been running those cattle for 6 years. He lost range he'd come to count on. And 3 weeks after Eliza sends him the correction notice, a competing claim shows up against your whole property. He set his hand down flat on the table. "I'm not saying I'm certain. I'm saying its price." The table was quiet. Eliza looked at her plate. She was thinking about the conversation at Hooper's store, about the careful, not quite confrontational way. Price had said, "I don't have a quarrel with you, Mrs. Boone." About the way he'd looked at her when she'd turned around that recalibration, that slight closing of expression. He had not been embarrassed. He had been deciding something. "Tomorrow we'll know," she said. Silas nodded. "And if it is him, then we know what we're dealing with," she said, which is always better than not knowing. Garrett was quiet through the rest of supper. He helped Silas clear the table afterward, which he didn't always do, and the two of them stood at the wash basin, talking in low voices about something she didn't try to hear. She took the 1,863 filing document and sat with it at the kitchen desk until late in the evening, reading it against the corrected survey Frick had filed, looking for what she needed. What she needed was a secondary reference point, because the cottonwood was gone, had been gone 15 years. But the original survey party, in 1,863, would not have relied on a single landmark for an entire 2,000-acre claim. That was not how careful land work was done, even in 1,863. They would have walked the line. They would have described multiple reference points. They would have built redundancy into the description in case of exactly this situation, a landmark lost to weather or time. She was looking for the one they hadn't challenged. It was in the third paragraph of the legal description, where the language shifted from the cottonwood reference to a compass bearing and a measurement in chains from the Northern Creek Bend. The Northern Creek Bend. She stood up and went to find the survey maps from Frick's corrected filing. She spread them on the kitchen table and found the Northern Creek Bend. It was marked clearly because Frick had used it as a secondary verification point in his own survey work. Still there. It was going to be there for a long time. She sat back down at the desk and began writing. The land office in Millhaven opened at 8 in the morning. Eliza and Garrett were there at 5 past. The clerk was a young man named Warren, who had the pressed, slightly anxious look of someone new to a job with a lot of paperwork. He found the competing claim filing after several minutes of searching, during which Eliza stood at the counter and Garrett stood slightly behind her, with his hat in his hands and his face doing the controlled thing. Warren set the file on the counter. The name on the competing claim was H.R. Price. Garrett's jaw tightened. One small movement. That was all. Eliza looked at the filing. It was 2 pages, clearly prepared by someone with legal training. The language was precise, and the argument about the lost cottonwood reference point was laid out in competent detail. Price had hired a lawyer. This was not an improvised act. This had been thought through. "I need to see the full legal description in this filing," she said to Warren, "and I need confirmation of whether R.H. Polly is the assigned examiner for the hearing." Warren confirmed both. Polly was assigned. Eliza read the legal description in Price's filing carefully. His lawyer had done good work. They had identified the cottonwood reference problem and built the entire argument on that single point. But they had not gone further. They had not addressed the Creek Bend reference. It meant they either hadn't found it, or they'd decided it wasn't relevant. They were wrong on the second count. She intended to make sure they were disappointed on the first. She straightened up from the counter. "I'll need to file a response," she said to Warren. "What is the procedure for filing a rebuttal to a competing claim before the hearing?" Warren blinked. "You can file a written rebuttal with supporting documentation at any time before the hearing date. It goes into the record." "Good," she said. "We'll have it ready by the end of next week." She turned toward the door. Garrett fell into step beside her, and they walked out into the June morning together. The street was beginning to fill with the day's business: a wagon from the north road, the baker's boy with a tray, Moke, 2 horses tied at the rail outside the feed store. "Creek Bend," Garrett said. "Yes, that's in Frick's corrected survey. Also in your father's original 1,863 filing," she said. Third paragraph. Price's lawyer built the argument entirely on the cottonwood and didn't address the secondary reference. "I think they either missed it or decided it wasn't strong enough to counter." She looked at him. They were wrong. Garrett was quiet for half a block. "Then you found that last night." "I found it around 11, she said. "I wasn't certain, until I checked it against the Frick survey this morning." He looked at her. The June sun was coming in at a low angle off the storefronts, and the streets smelled of horses and fresh bread and the particular mineral dust of Wyoming that she had come to find familiar. He was looking at her in the way he had on the porch that evening, the direct look with no managing in it. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right." "The rebuttal," he said. "Can you write it? The way it needs to be written?" She considered the question. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "Neither was the person who wrote Price's filing," he said, "and theirs missed the creek bend." She looked at the street ahead of them. "I can write it," she said. "I'll need to spend several days on it. I'll need Frick's survey documents, your father's original filing, and probably a copy of the territorial land statutes from 1863. Where do we get the statutes?" "The land office will have them," she said. "Or the county courthouse." He nodded once. "Then let's go back," he said. They walked back to where the horses were tied. The morning was clear, and the sky above Millhaven was the wide, indifferent blue that Wyoming did in summer, and Eliza was already composing the first paragraph of the rebuttal in her head as she untied her horse and checked the cinch and mounted without assistance, because she had learned to do that in the first 2 weeks and had not needed help since. The hearing was in 30 days. She had written harder things in less time. She settled into the saddle and turned the horse toward the road home, and the rebuttal took shape in her mind. The whole ride back not the finished thing yet, but the skeleton of it, the argument's spine, place where the creek bend reference sat like a keystone in a wall. Price's lawyer had tried to pull down from the wrong side. Behind her, Garrett kept pace without pushing. He did not ask what she was thinking. He had learned by now, she suspected, that when she was quiet on horseback she was working, and working was best left undisturbed. The ranch appeared at the end of the road. In the late morning light, solid and unchanged, the east pasture green behind the fence line, Dolph visible near the barn doing something, with the fence posts that had probably just occurred to him was necessary. She had 30 days. She had the creek bend. She had a case. The rebuttal took 9 days to write. Not because Eliza was slow, she was not slow, had never been slow, at anything requiring sustained concentration and careful language, but because the thing she was building had to be precise in a way that left no gap for interpretation. A land board hearing was not a conversation. It was a record. Everything she put on paper would be read by R.H. Pauley, and possibly by people above him, and if the argument had a single loose joint, Price's lawyer would find it the way cold finds a gap under a door. She worked at the kitchen desk each morning before anyone else was up, in the hour between 4 and 5, when the ranch was completely quiet, and the only sound was the occasional shift of the horses in the barn, and the small sounds a house makes when the temperature drops before dawn. She had always done her best thinking in that hour. In Virginia, it had been lesson plans and budget columns. Here it was land law and survey mathematics, and the particular grammar of legal description that she had been learning in dense, accelerating chunks from the territorial statute documents. Warren had pulled from the county courthouse files. Creek Bend argument was solid. She had confirmed that 3 separate times using 3 different methods of verification. The 1863 filing described it with enough precision that any competent surveyor could locate it today. And Aldous Frick had already located it, had already marked it in the corrected survey as a secondary reference point, which meant there was current, independently verified documentation supporting its use. What she needed to add was the historical record, because Price's lawyer's argument rested not just on the missing cottonwood, but on the implied principle that the entire property description was therefore void that, without the primary reference point, nothing downstream from it was legally anchored. That was a creative interpretation, and she could see why a lawyer had tried it. But it was wrong, and the wrongness was demonstrable. If you went back to the original 1863 Territorial Land Code, which she had now read in its entirety twice. Under the 1863 code, A natural landmark cited as a primary reference in a homestead filing could be replaced by any secondary reference point cited in the same document, provided that secondary point could be independently verified. The code had been written this way specifically because the men who wrote it understood that the frontier was a place where trees got struck by lightning and creek channels shifted, and the landscape did not hold still out of respect for paperwork. Price's lawyer, working from a later version of the statute, had missed that provision entirely. The 1878 revision had reorganized the section, and the original language had been moved and condensed in a way that made it easy to overlook. She wrote that argument out clearly, with citations to the specific sections of both the 1863 and 1878 codes, with a direct quotation from the original provision, and with a paragraph explaining precisely why the reorganization of the later revision did not eliminate the original principle. It had simply been absorbed into a more general section on boundary verification. She was, as she had told Garrett, not a lawyer, but she had spent 8 years writing communications to county school boards that were read by lawyers, and she knew how to write something that a lawyer would read with respect rather than with the instinct to find the weakest point. When she finished the 9th day's revision, she read the complete document from the beginning. 6 pages. It was clear, it was sourced. The argument built in the right order, and the language was precise without being inaccessible. She set it down on the kitchen desk and sat for a moment in the early morning quiet. Then she picked up her pencil and made 2 small corrections in the 4th paragraph, where the language was slightly imprecise, and she was done. Garrett read it that morning while she made coffee. He read it the way he read everything important completely and without comment until he had finished. When he set it down, he was quiet for a moment. The 1863 code provision, he said. Found that in the courthouse documents. 4th document in the 2nd box Warren pulled, she said. I almost missed it. The handwriting on the section headers was difficult. He looked at the document again. Price's lawyer didn't find it. Either didn't find it or found it and decided it wasn't strong enough to address, she said. The second possibility concerns me more. Garrett looked up. They know it's there and chose to ignore it, she said. It means they think Polly won't look that far back. It means they've built the argument for an examiner who they expect to rule on the surface of the filing rather than the underlying statute. She paused. Which means we need to know something about Polly. Garrett set the document down. What kind of something? Whether he's a thorough examiner or a fast one, she said. Whether he has any prior relationship with Price or Price's lawyer. Whether there's anything about his record at the land board that would indicate how he handles cases where the statute history is relevant. Garrett looked at her steadily. You think Price might have picked his examiner? I think it's worth knowing whether that's possible, she said. Question sat between them. It was the kind of question that, Virginia, she would have known who to ask the county clerk, the school board secretary, the invisible network of people who keep track of how things actually work, as opposed to how they're supposed to work. In Millhaven, she was still mapping that network. Abe Hooper, she said. Garrett's expression shifted slightly. The store. He's been here 20 years, she said. He knows everyone. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then I'll talk to him. We'll talk to him, she said. He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window at the low, early summer angle, and he had not yet put on his hat, which made him look slightly different from the man. She saw most of the day less composed, more present. He had a habit, she had noticed, of being more open in the early morning, before the day's work organized him back into his usual efficiency. We'll talk to him, he said. Abe Hooper was behind his counter when they came in that afternoon, doing inventory with a pencil stub and a focus that suggested he was counting something he expected to have less of than he needed. He looked up when they came in, registered both of them, and set the pencil down. Boons, he said. He used the plural without apparent thought, which Eliza noticed. Garrett leaned on the counter. Abe, what do you know about R? H. Polly? Hooper looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Eliza. Then he looked back at Garrett. Land Board Examiner Polly. Same one. Hooper picked up the pencil again and turned it slowly between two fingers. He's been examiner for 6 years. Out of Cheyenne originally. He's got a reputation for running tight hearings, doesn't let things go long, doesn't like testimony that wanders. He paused. He's thorough on the paperwork side. More thorough than the previous examiner. Why, has he ruled on boundary disputes before? Eliza asked. 3 or 4 that I know of. 2 of them he ruled for the claimant, 2 for the original holder. Hooper set the pencil flat on the counter. He doesn't have a pattern that I've seen. Rules on the evidence, from what I've heard. Any connection to Harlan Price? Garrett said. Hooper was quiet for a beat. Not the quiet of a man who doesn't know, but the quiet of a man deciding how much knowing to share. Nothing I'd call a connection, he said carefully. They've been in the same room at the Cattlemen's Association meetings. Price donated to the Millhaven Road Fund last fall, which Polly was involved with in an administrative capacity. He paused. I wouldn't call it a relationship. I'd call it acquaintance. Garrett looked at him. Is that a concern? Hooper met his eyes. I'd make sure the paperwork was very good, he said. Eliza looked at the 6 pages of the rebuttal, folded in her coat pocket. It's very good, she said. They filed the rebuttal on a Tuesday 16 days before the hearing. Warren accepted it, stamped it, put it in the file, and told them it would be in the record for Polly's review before the hearing date. Walking out of the land office, Garrett held the door for her, a small automatic thing, and she stepped through it, and they stood for a moment on the board sidewalk with the June sun very warm overhead. Now we wait, he said. Now we wait, she agreed. The waiting was harder than the writing. She could manage the writing, because writing gave her the problem in a form she could work on. Waiting gave it back to her in a form she couldn't touch. The ranch continued. It continued the way it always did, because a cattle operation doesn't pause for human uncertainty. The animals need water and movement and feed, regardless of what is or isn't happening at the county land office. And the grass keeps growing or stops growing, based on weather rather than anxiety. Eliza found the continuity both frustrating and useful. Frustrating because her mind wanted to work on the hearing, and useful because the ranch work gave it something else to work on instead, which was probably healthier. Silas had been quieter since they'd told him about the filing. He worked the same as always consistently, without complaint, in the particular way that had become his rhythm, on the spread, but the easy quality that had begun to develop in him after the debt was clear had drawn back in. He was worried. He was worried in the way someone worries when they feel responsible for a chain of events, even if the specific link they're standing on isn't their fault. Eliza said nothing about it for a week. Then, on a warm Thursday evening, she found him at the creek again. He seemed to go there when he was carrying something, and she sat on the same rock she'd sat on before, and neither of them said anything for a while. "This isn't because of you," she said. He looked at the water. "I brought Price's attention to the property," he said. "I hadn't come and run up the debt, you wouldn't have needed the survey correction. If you hadn't filed the survey correction, Price wouldn't have had a reason to go after the title." "That's a long chain," she said. "It holds together." "Does," she said. "But at the end of it, the person who filed the competing claim is Price, not you." She paused. "You're not responsible for what angry men do when they don't get their way." Silas was quiet. He stopped. I wanted to come here and make things easier for Garrett, not harder. "You cleared your debt," she said. "You worked every day of 60 days without asking for anything. And the east pasture is producing the best grass on the property." She looked at the creek. "The harder things aren't your fault. Some of them might not have happened the same way without you here. But fault and consequence are different things." Creek made its thin, steady sound. "Where'd you learn to think like that?" he asked. "Same place I learned everything else," she said. "Experience, mostly, and reading." He almost smiled. Garrett said, "You're the most practical person he's ever met." She looked at the water. When did he say that? 2 nights ago, when I asked him how he was managing all this. Silas picked up a small flat stone from the bank and turned it in his fingers. He said he wasn't managing it. He said you were, and he was mostly trying not to slow you down. She sat with that for a moment. It was, she thought, probably the most accurate thing Garrett Boone had ever said about their arrangement. Also, in its unsentimental way, more meaningful than most compliments she had ever received. He's not slowing me down, she said. I know, Silas said. I think he's starting to know it too. The hearing was on a Friday morning at the county courthouse in Millhaven, in a room with 3 long windows, 6 chairs for observers, and a table at the front where R. H. Pauley sat with the file in front of him and a glass of water he hadn't touched. Pauley was not what Eliza had pictured. She had pictured someone older, more settled into authority. What she saw was a man in his mid-40s, trim and precise in his movements, with reading glasses he removed and replaced at intervals that suggested they were a tool rather than a habit. He had the careful assessing quality of someone who is always measuring the distance between what people tell him and what is actually in the documents. She had been right about the paperwork side. He had read everything. She could tell from the way he looked at both filings that he had read them recently and had marked sections, because he went directly to specific pages without searching. Price was there with his lawyer, a man named Garton from Cheyenne, who was taller than she'd expected, and who looked at Eliza when she sat down with the particular blankness of a lawyer who is recalculating something. He had not clearly expected her to be present. He had probably expected Garrett, or possibly no one, a ranch owner, who would send a letter rather than appear. Dolph had come. He sat in the observer chairs, in his good shirt, which was not his good shirt so much as his less worked shirt, and he looked at everything in the room with the same neutral expression he gave most things. Silas had wanted to come. Eliza had told him to stay with the cattle because someone needed to, and it was not a discussion. He had understood that she was right and had still looked for a moment, like a man who wanted to argue about it. Garrett sat beside Eliza at the respondent's table. He had put on his better jacket, and he had shaved, which he did not always do on weekdays, and he sat with his hands flat on the table in front of him the way he did when he was managing something. Pauley opened the hearing with the precision of a man who has run many such proceedings and has arrived at efficiency not through impatience, but through experience. He read the formal description of the competing claim. He read the basis of the challenge. He looked up over his glasses. Mr. Garton, he said, your client's claim rests on the assertion that the primary reference point in the 1863 filing is no longer existent, and that this creates a fundamental defect in the property's legal description. Correct? Garton stood. That is correct, Mr. Pauley. The great cottonwood at Boone's Crossing, named as the primary reference point in the original filing, was destroyed by lightning approximately 15 years ago. Without that landmark, the boundary description cannot be verified from its stated origin point, rendering the entire legal description potentially void. Pauley nodded. Made a note, Mrs. Boone, he said. He had read the rebuttal and found her name on it, and appeared to have arrived at his own conclusions about what that meant. Your rebuttal addresses the secondary reference point. Would you like to present that argument? She stood. She had not prepared remarks in the formal sense, not a speech, not a presentation. She had prepared the argument which was in the document, and she trusted the document. What she needed to do was explain it clearly in spoken language to a man who had already read it and was now listening to confirm that the person who wrote it understood it as well as the writing suggested. Mr. Pauley, she said, the 1863 filing contains 2 reference points, not one. Primary reference is the cottonwood, as Mr. Garton noted. The secondary reference, in the 3rd paragraph of the legal description, is the Northern Creek Bend at the property's upper boundary. That bend is a permanent geological feature that has not moved and can be independently verified, and has been by Aldous Frick's corrected survey filed with this office in April of this year. She paused. The 1863 Territorial Land Code, Section 14, Paragraph 3, provides that where a primary reference point is lost to natural causes, any secondary reference point cited in the same filing may be used to anchor the legal description, provided the secondary point can be independently verified. Creek Bend satisfies that requirement. The corrected survey confirms it. The challenge filed by Mr. Price is built on the assumption that the cottonwood is the only anchor for this property's description. The assumption is incorrect. The room was quiet. Polly looked at his documents. He turned to a specific page. She could see from where she sat that it was the page she had cited and read it. Then he looked up at Garton. "Mr. Garton," he said, "were you aware of the 1863 code provision?" Garton's expression held. He was a professional. "We were aware of the provision," he said. "We considered its application and concluded it was not applicable. In this instance, given the reorganization of that section in the 1878 revision." "On what basis?" Polly said. Garton began to explain. The explanation was competent, but it had a fundamental problem, which was that the 1878 revision had not eliminated the provision it had reorganized it, which was a different thing. And Eliza had cited that distinction specifically in the rebuttal, and Polly had clearly read it. Polly let Garton finish. Then he looked at the documents again. Garrett beside Eliza was completely still. "Mrs. Boone," Polly said, "your rebuttal cites the 1878 revision in your footnotes. You argue the reorganization did not alter the underlying principle. Is that your position?" "It is," she said. "The 1878 revision consolidated several sections for clarity, but did not repeal or modify the core provision. The language is different, but the legal principle is the same. I cited both versions in the rebuttal specifically, so the board could compare them directly." Polly looked at both documents for a long moment. Then he removed his glasses and set them on the table. "I'm going to take a recess," he said. "I need to review the statutory history before I proceed." The recess was 40 minutes. Eliza sat at the table and did not talk. Garrett sat beside her and did not talk. Dolph in the observer chairs looked at the ceiling. Price sat across the room with his arms crossed and his expression giving nothing away, and Garton was close to him, writing something on a pad in the manner of a lawyer who wants to appear to be doing something useful. When Polly returned, he sat down and put his glasses back on and looked at the room as a whole before he looked at the documents. "The 1863 provision is clear," he said. "The 1878 revision did not eliminate it. The Northern Creek Bend is cited in the original filing as a secondary reference point and has been independently verified by a licensed survey filed with this office. The legal description of the Boone Cross property is not void." He looked at Price's table. "The competing claim is without foundation. It is dismissed." The room went quiet in the particular way of a room where something final has been said. Price uncrossed his arms slowly. His face moved through something not shock, but the acceptance of a result he had not been certain of, arriving. He looked at Eliza for a moment. Then he looked away. Garton made a note on his pad. Polly was already moving to the next item on his agenda. Garrett exhaled beside her, not dramatically, not loudly, just the long, controlled breath of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. Felt his hand cover hers on the table. A brief, deliberate pressure. Then he took it away. She looked at the window. Outside, Millhaven was going about its Friday with no awareness that anything had just been resolved in this room, and the sky above the street was the same wide, indifferent blue it always was, and the horses at the rail were waiting patiently to go home. Dolph was already on his feet. They did not celebrate exactly on the ride back. What happened was quieter than celebration. Dolph rode ahead. He always rode ahead. It was how he processed things, and Garrett and Eliza rode side by side on the road back toward the ranch. and the afternoon was warm in the way June afternoons get warm in Wyoming, with a directness that Virginia's humidity always diffused. They did not speak for the first mile. Then Garrett said, "You knew it would hold." "I thought it would hold," she said. "There's a difference." Before the recess, when Polly went to review the statutes, "Were you certain?" She considered the honest answer. "I was certain the argument was correct," she said. "I was not certain Polly would agree." Garrett looked at the road ahead. "But you were calm." "Being not calm wouldn't have helped anything." "Quiet for a moment." "That's not what I mean." She looked at him. He was watching the road with a particular expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore when he was approaching something he wanted to say, and was choosing the words carefully, not because he was trying to manage her, but because he took language seriously and did not like imprecision in things that mattered. "What do you mean?" she said. "I mean, I was sitting next to you for 40 minutes during that recess," he said, "and you sat there like you were waiting for a supply order to come through. Not performing. Not pretending." He paused. "I couldn't have done that." She thought about what to say to that. "You weren't sitting still," she said. "You were thinking." "I could tell." "What was I thinking?" "About what happens if it goes wrong," she said. "About what you do next if Polly rules the other way. You were running contingencies." She looked at the road. "That's not the same as being afraid. That's preparation. You're good at it." He looked at her. "That's how you manage it," she said. "You don't wait, you think ahead." "And you?" "I wait," she said. "But I wait with something in my hand." She paused. "The argument was the thing in my hand. As long as I knew the argument was right, I could wait." He nodded slowly. The road curved around a low rise, and the ranch came into view. Below them, the barn, the house, the green line of the east pasture along the creek, Silas visible as a small figure near the south fence. "I need to tell you something," Garrett said. His tone had changed. Not darker, more careful. The way someone speaks when they have arrived at the edge of something they've been approaching for a while. She waited. "When I started writing to the agency," he said, "I told myself it was practical. I needed someone who could manage accounts and handle correspondence, and wasn't going to fall apart in a hard winter." He kept his eyes on the road. And all of that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. "What was the rest of it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily down the slope toward the ranch. "I'd been running this place alone for 14 years, he said. He stopped. Started again. "I was good at it. I knew how to do the work. I knew how to manage the seasons and the cattle and the accounts. But I'd gotten to a place where the only person I talked to about any of it was Dolph. And Dolph's a fine man, but..." He paused. "He doesn't ask questions." She waited. "You asked questions in the first letter," Garrett said. "You pushed back on what I'd written. You said you weren't coming unless it was real, not just an arrangement." He looked at her briefly. "I hadn't had a conversation like that in years. Not with anyone." Another pause. "By the third letter, I knew the practical part was only part of it." The ranch was close now. She could see Silas had spotted them and straightened up from the fence work. "You could have told me about Silas," she said. The words were not hard. They were just the truth, set between them again, the way it had been before, not as accusation but as the remaining gap that had to be closed. "I know," he said. "I was afraid you'd decide the complications weren't worth it. And by the time I knew you well enough to know that you wouldn't, it felt too late to say it without it looking worse than it was." She looked at the east pasture. The grass was good. The creek was running clear. Silas was walking up toward them now, waiting to hear what had happened. "It looked worse because you waited," she said. "Yes, and if you'd told me in the fourth letter?" He thought about it. "You'd have asked questions," he said. "You'd have wanted to understand the full situation. And I'd have had to explain it, which means I'd have had to think through it more carefully than I had." He paused. "Probably I'd have had a better plan by the time you arrived." "Yes," she said. "Probably." They reached the yard. Silas came forward. With the question visible on his face, he'd said a word. "Dismissed," Garrett said. Silas stopped walking. Then he let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. He put his hands on his hips and looked at the ground for a moment, and Eliza looked away because that was the right thing to do. Dolph made supper that evening. He was not a skilled cook, and everyone at the table knew it, but he had decided on his own to make the meal, and nobody was inclined to argue with the impulse. The result was edible and warm and served with the kind of blunt adequacy that was somehow entirely appropriate for the occasion. They ate. They talked about the East Pasture's second rotation schedule. They talked about Cutter's letter from Colorado, which had arrived that week, with news that he had a second buyer interested in a different parcel of land near Pueblo, which had no bearing on any of them directly, but which Silas had found interesting enough to mention. They talked about the pump housing on the north, well that Dolph said was developing another issue and would need addressing before fall. They did not talk about the hearing. The hearing was finished. What had happened there was already in the past, filed into the courthouse record, and the ranch had its concerns going forward that were more immediate and more manageable, and belonged to tomorrow rather than today. After supper, Silas helped Dolph clear the table with a willingness that had become, over the months, simply part of how things worked in that kitchen. Dolph accepted the help without comment, which was the closest he got to appreciation. Garrett and Eliza went out to the porch. The evening was the warmest it had been. The sky was still light at the western edge, a long orange line above the mountains, and the grass in the east pasture was dark and quiet in the cooling air. Somewhere across the valley, a coyote made its high, thread-like sound, and then stopped. They sat in the usual chairs and for a while said nothing. "What you said on the ride back," Eliza said. Garrett looked at her. "About the letters," she said. "About knowing by the third one that it wasn't only practical." He waited. "I knew by the second," she said. He was still for a moment. "You didn't say anything," he said. "Neither did you," she said. The coyote called again, farther away. The orange line above the mountains had gone pale, and the first stars were coming out in the east. "I wasn't sure," she said, "about what it meant, about whether it would survive the distance between a letter and a person." She paused. People can be very different on paper. And she looked at the east pasture, the land they had kept, at the grass that was growing on ground that was legally, officially, entirely theirs. "You're not very different," she said. "You're more difficult in person, more careful, more complicated." She paused. "But you're not different." He looked at her. "Is that good?" he said. "It's very good," she said. "Difficult and complicated I can work with. Different would have been the problem." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding something, working through it in the careful, deliberate way he worked through things that mattered. "Eliza," he said. "I know," she said, and she did know. She knew the way you know something that has been building across months and across distance and across a cattle debt and a boundary error and a competing claim and 40 minutes in a courthouse waiting room. Something that doesn't announce itself. Dramatically but simply arrives, the way the east pasture grass had arrived, slowly and then fully and without asking permission. She reached over and put her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat there while the last light left the sky, and the stars came fully out, and the ranch settled into the particular quiet of a summer night, with all the work of the day finished and the morning's work not yet begun. Dolph's lamp was visible through the bunkhouse window. Silas's voice came occasionally from inside the house, talking to no one in particular the way he did when he was content. The east pasture was dark and solid, and there. The land was theirs and had always been, and now it was documented and defended and would not be easily taken from them. And in the morning there would be work, and in the afternoon there would be decisions, and in the evening there would be the porch, and the cooling air, and the particular company of a person you have chosen, and who has chosen you, imperfectly and deliberately, and without either of you having said it in those exact words yet. But that conversation was coming. Some things simply needed the right evening. The right evening came 3 days later. Not because the timing was romantic in any planned sense, it wasn't, and neither of them would have been comfortable with planned romance. which was perhaps one of the things they had in common that had never been explicitly discussed but was simply understood. It came because on a Monday evening in late June, with the ranch work finished and supper cleared, and Dolph in the bunkhouse and Silas reading something at the kitchen table, Garrett came to find Eliza where she was sitting on the porch steps, watching the last of the light, and he sat down beside her, and after a few minutes of quiet, he said, without any particular ceremony, "I'd like us to be married. Not will you marry me?" Not a question with a question mark at the end. Just a statement of what he wanted, offered plainly, the way he offered everything that mattered to him directly, without decoration, leaving her the full space to respond. She looked at the east pasture for a moment. "When?" she said. "When you're ready," he said. "Not before." She looked at him. He was watching the pasture with the expression of a man who has said the thing he meant to say and is now genuinely waiting, not performing patience, but actually practicing it the real kind, the kind that doesn't require an answer in the next 30 seconds. She had been in Wyoming for nearly 4 months. She had arrived in freezing March with $2 and a carpet bag and 6 months of letters, and had found, in the place of the simple arrangement she had been promised, debt and a brother and a boundary error and a competing land claim and a man who was simultaneously more honest and more frightened than his letters had suggested. She had done more work in 4 months than she had done in her last 2 years in Virginia. She had not once wished she had stayed. "July," she said. He looked at her. "I'd like to be married in July," she said, "before the summer gets too far along." Something moved across his face that she had never seen there before, not the controlled steadiness, not the careful management, but something underneath all of that which was simply relief. The relief of a man who has been holding his breath for months and has finally been told he can breathe. "July," he said. "Yes," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders. Not dramatically, just the weight of it, settling there. She leaned into it slightly, which was the closest either of them was going to get to sentiment that evening. And it was enough. Inside, Silas turned a page. They told him the next morning at breakfast. He looked at both of them for a moment. Then he stood up from the table and shook Garrett's hand with a grip that went on a beat longer than handshakes usually do. The kind that says something the hands don't have words for. Then he looked at Eliza and said, "I was starting to wonder when he was going to get around to it." Garrett said, "Sit down, Silas." "I'm just saying it took him." "Sit down." Silas sat down, grinning in a way he hadn't grinned since before Colorado, since before the debt and the failure and the long road back to being the person he had been before those things had happened to him. It was a good thing to see. Dolph, informed later that morning, said, "Good," and went back to work on the pump housing, which was the Dolph version of a wedding toast and was understood as such by everyone present. Eliza wrote to the placement agency in Richmond, not because she was required to. The arrangement had always been contingent on both parties agreeing, and she had agreed, but because the woman who had handled her correspondence there, a Mrs. Aldridge, had been kind and specific in a profession that could easily have been neither, and Eliza felt the woman deserved to know how it had turned out. She wrote a short letter. She said she was to be married in July. She said the ranch was sound and the work was real. She said Wyoming was nothing like Virginia, and she had discovered she preferred it that way. She did not say everything. There was no way to put everything into a letter: the 60 days, the boundary, the courthouse hearing, the 9 days of writing the rebuttal, the porch in the evening, with Garrett's arm around her shoulders. Some things are not letter-sized. She sealed it and gave it to the boy from the telegraph office, who made the mail runs on Wednesdays, and she did not think about Virginia again for a very long time. The wedding was on a Saturday in the second week of July. It was held in Millhaven, at the office of the Justice of the Peace, because neither Garrett nor Eliza had interest in anything larger. The Justice of the Peace was a stocky, efficient man named Birch, who had performed enough frontier weddings to have arrived at a version of the ceremony that was dignified without being lengthy, which was the exact version both of them wanted. Silas stood beside Garrett. Dolph stood beside Eliza, which had been her idea, and which Dolph had accepted with the expression of a man trying to remain neutral about something that had clearly touched him. Abe Hooper came because he had heard and showed up at the door, and nobody told him to leave. He stood at the back with his hat in his hands and was quieter than Eliza had ever seen him. The ceremony took 11 minutes. When Birch said, "You may seal this union," Garrett kissed her once, briefly, in the manner of a man who is aware there are people watching and is not accustomed to an audience for private things, and Eliza kissed him back with the same economy. Dolph looked at the ceiling, and Silas looked at the floor, and Abe Hooper cleared his throat very softly. Afterward, on the sidewalk outside, Silas said, "That's it? 11 minutes? Did you want it to be longer?" Eliza said. "I just expected." He stopped. No, that was right. It was right. It was exactly right. What she had not expected, what she thought about in the weeks after the wedding, turning it over the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath, was how little the formal event changed the texture of daily life. She had expected something to shift, some reorganization of the household's rhythms, some new feeling attached to the word wife that was different from the feeling attached to the previous 4 months of being something more ambiguous. Instead, the ranch continued. The cattle needed moving. The accounts needed updating. The East Pasture's second rotation came in strong, which she had predicted and which still gave her quiet satisfaction. The pump housing on the north well, which Dolph had been managing as an ongoing crisis for weeks, finally required a full replacement, which cost more than he'd anticipated and slightly less than Eliza had budgeted for, which meant the margin held. Marriage, she discovered, was not a new thing layered on top of the existing one. It was a name given to what was already there. She had been doing the work of this partnership since the first evening she sat down with the account ledger by lamplight while the Wyoming wind pressed against the walls. The certificate from Birch's office changed the legal description of their relationship, the same way the corrected survey had changed the legal description of the East Pasture. It made official what was already real. She told Garrett this one evening, and he was quiet for a moment, and then said, "I think that's the most practical thing anyone has ever said about marriage." "Is that a complaint?" she said. "No," he said. "It's the best thing you've ever said to me." She wasn't sure that was true, but she let him have it. Silas left in August. He had told them in July that he was thinking about it, not leaving in the way he had left Colorado, failure and scramble, but leaving with intention, with a plan that had been building since the day the Meridian receipt arrived. There was a cattle operation near Laramie looking for an experienced hand with ranch management knowledge, who could potentially grow into an overseer position within a season or two. A man named Aldridge, no relation to the Richmond agency woman, just a coincidence that amused Eliza briefly, who had heard about Silas through a contact at the Millhaven stockyard. "It's a real position," Silas said at supper the week before he left, with the manner of a man who is still slightly disbelieving of his own good fortune. Not just day labor. An actual position with a salary and a defined role. "Of course it is," Eliza said. "You've spent the last 5 months proving you can do the work." "I spent them trying to pay off a debt," Silas said. "Same thing," she said. "Anyone watching you work knew what you were capable of." Apparently someone was watching. The stockyard contact, it emerged, was Dolph, who had mentioned Silas to a buyer from Laramie at the spring market in a characteristically brief and accurate way that had eventually reached Aldridge's ears. Dolph, when this was revealed at supper, looked at his plate and said nothing. Silas looked at him for a moment. "Dolph, you're good with cattle," Dolph said. Seemed worth mentioning. Silas nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they're managing something that is more than they want to show at the dinner table. "Thank you," he said. Dolph picked up his fork. On the morning Silas left, Garrett loaded his brother's things into a rented wagon from town. There was more than had arrived in March, because a man who works for 5 months acquires things gradually: a second pair of work boots, coat he'd needed for the cool spring nights, a small collection of practical tools he'd assembled over the weeks. Not much. Enough to show that the stay had been real. They stood in the yard in the early morning, the three of them. Garrett put his hand out. Silas took it and then pulled him in, briefly, the way brothers do when they're trying not to make too much of something that is, in fact, a great deal. Garrett put his hand on the back of his brother's neck once, quickly, and then stepped back. Silas turned to Eliza. "I came here with nothing but problems," he said, "and you treated them like they were solvable." "They were solvable," she said. "You didn't know that when I showed up." "No," she said, "but I thought it was worth trying." He looked at her for a moment with the open expression that had always distinguished him from Garrett, the face that didn't protect itself as much, that let things show through more easily. "I'm glad he wrote those letters," he said. "I'm glad you came." "So am I," she said. He climbed up to the wagon seat and clicked the horses forward. End of the yard, he lifted his hat once without turning around, and then he was on the road to Millhaven, and from there to Laramie, and from there to wherever the next version of Silas Boone was going to live. Garrett stood beside Eliza and watched until the wagon was too small to read clearly. "He'll be all right," she said. "He will," Garrett said. He sounded certain, which she had learned meant he actually was. Garrett did not perform certainty. When he wasn't sure, he said so. They stood there for another moment. "East pasture rotation today?" she said. "This afternoon," he said. "Morning, I want to look at the north fence. The accounts need updating before the end of the week," she said. "I know," he said. They walked back toward the house together, and the ranch continued, as it always had, as it always would. By September, the East pasture had delivered what Eliza had projected in the most optimistic column of her spring estimates, and then had exceeded it by 11%, which was the kind of result that made a person simultaneously satisfied and suspicious that they had gotten lucky. She told Garrett this. "You think it's luck?" he said. "I think the grass was genuinely better than I'd estimated," she said. "Means my estimate was conservative, or the grass was good, and your estimate was also good," he said. "Both things." She looked at the column of figures. "It's a strong close to the year. The strongest since my father ran it," Garrett said. He said it simply, without sentiment, as a statement of record. But she understood what it meant under the surface. 14 years of running this ranch alone, rebuilding what a bad season had taken, and now in the year that was supposed to be the hard year, the year with the debt and the hearing and the competing claim, it had closed as the best one. There was something almost ironic in that. Almost. She was not quite ready to call it ironic. Irony implied coincidence, and she was not certain it was coincidence. She had a theory one she had not voiced to Garrett, not because she was protecting it, but because she was still working out whether she believed it that the year had closed well, in part because of the pressure it had been under. Debt had forced the survey. The survey had corrected the boundary. The boundary correction had provoked Price. Price's challenge had required a rebuttal that brought her and Garrett, for the first time, fully into each other's confidence, sitting across from Polly, depending on each other's competence in a room where the stakes were real. And the East pasture, freed from 6 years of Price's cattle, had grown the way things grow when they're finally given room. She was not saying the hard year had been good. It had been genuinely hard. The debt, the 60 days, the courthouse, all of it had cost something real, in sleep and worry, and the particular kind of stress that comes from not knowing how something large is going to land. She was saying that the hard year had produced things that the easy year would not have. She understood this was a version of the thing people said when they wanted to make loss feel meaningful. She understood that was a trap. Not everything hard is productive. Not every loss leads somewhere. Sometimes things just go wrong, and that's the whole story. But sometimes not always. Not reliably. Not in any way you could depend on. In advance, the pressure does produce the thing. East pasture was the thing. The marriage was the thing. And the woman sitting at a kitchen desk in Wyoming with a ranch ledger and a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm, who had come 1,200 miles on the strength of 6 months of letters to a man she had never met, was very much the thing, not despite the complications she had walked into, but because she had been the kind of person who looked at complications and reached for a pencil. Harlan Price came to the ranch in late September. Came alone, which Eliza noted. No lawyer, no ranch hand, no supporting company. Just Price on his gray quarter horse, arriving in the yard at mid-morning on a Thursday with the deliberate manner of a man who has made a decision and is intending to follow through. Garrett was at the south pasture. Eliza was in the front room at the desk. She heard the horse and went to the door. Price dismounted and stood with his hat in his hands. This was different from every previous time she had seen him. Every other time he had been on horseback, looking down, working from the advantage of height and the implication of being in transit, a man who could leave if the conversation didn't suit him. Now he was standing in her yard with his hat in his hands, and he was not going anywhere. "Mrs. Boone," he said. "Mr. Price," she said. She stepped off the porch because receiving him from the doorway felt like a choice about power that she wasn't interested in making. "I owe you and your husband an apology," he said. He said it flat, without preamble, without the softening language that people use when they want credit for the apology without fully making it. Just the statement. She looked at him. "The boundary correction was legitimate," he said. "I knew that when Frick filed it, I was angry about the cattle inconvenience, and I made a bad decision." He paused. "Claim I filed using Garton. That was a bad decision made by an angry man who had more access to lawyers than sense at that particular moment." Eliza said nothing. She had learned from Virginia, from 8 years of school boards, from the particular education of the last 6 months, that when someone is saying something that costs them something, the right response is to let them finish. "I've run my cattle on that section for 6 years, because nobody told me otherwise," Price said. "I know that doesn't make it right. But I want you to understand that I wasn't deliberately trespassing on your land. I thought it was open range." "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I've known that since the beginning," she said. "That's why my letter to you used the word misunderstanding, because that's what it was, until it became something else." Price was quiet for a moment. "Until I made it something else," he said. "Yes." He looked at his hat. He turned it once in his hands. "I'd like to continue as neighbors," he said. "I'd like to put the last few months behind us and continue as neighbors who have sorted out a property misunderstanding and don't intend to repeat it." "So would I," she said immediately. "So would Garrett." He looked up. "You're sure about Garrett?" "I'm sure," she said. "He's not a grudge holder. He never has been." She paused. "Are you?" Price looked at her for a moment, and something in his face, the closed, evaluating expression he had worn, every time she'd seen him opened slightly. Not all the way, but enough. "I'm working on it," he said. It was, she thought, the most honest thing he had said to her. "That's good enough," she said. She put her hand out. He shook it briefly. Correctly, the handshake of two people who are not friends, but are choosing not to be enemies, which was its own useful category and one she had always believed was undervalued. He mounted his horse and rode back down the road. She watched him go. When Garrett came in from the south pasture at noon and she told him, he listened, and then was quiet for a moment and then said, "You shook his hand." "I did." "Good," he said, and poured himself water and asked about the north fence assessment she'd been meaning to look at, because that was where the day's attention was needed, and Garrett had always been practical about where to put his attention. It was, she had come to understand, one of the things she loved about him. October came in hard the way Wyoming Octobers did, without warning, without the gradual preparation of Virginia falls, just a sudden decision by the sky to shift from summer to cold over the course of about 48 hours. She woke one morning to frost on the inside of the window pane, and Dolph already in the yard pulling a tarp over the hay stores, because Dolph felt weather before it arrived in some bone-deep way that she had come to respect without trying to understand. Cattle were moved to the winter pasture. The accounts were closed for the season, and the final numbers recorded in the ledger in Eliza's handwriting. Clear columns, accurate figures, a margin that was the best the Boone Cross spread had seen since Garrett's father ran it in its prime. She wrote the year's summary on the ledger's inside cover in her usual hand, the spring rotation, the East Pasture's output, the fall close. The debt was not mentioned because the debt was over, and this was a record of the ranch, not of every trial attached to it. She looked at the summary when she had finished writing it. Good work. Not perfect. She had made 3 calculation errors over the course of the year, caught them herself, corrected them without drama. The eastern grazing projection had been 11% conservative. The well repair had cost more than the first estimate and slightly less than the contingency she'd built in, which meant the contingency had been correctly sized. These were small things. They were also evidence of a mind that was paying attention. She closed the ledger. She had been a school teacher in Virginia. She had managed children and county budgets and the particular frustrations of an institution that was always underfunded and overdemanded. She had done it well. But she had always felt, at the edge of that life, the particular friction of a person who is doing what they can in the space available to them when the space is slightly smaller than what they actually need. Here the space was different. Wyoming was not generous in the soft ways. It was cold and it was hard and it was relentless in the specific way that places which don't care about you are relentless. The land did not reward feeling. It rewarded attention, preparation, the kind of thinking that happens before the problem becomes a crisis. It rewarded exactly the kind of mind she had. She had not come looking for that. She had come looking for a man who wrote good letters and meant what he said. But you find things in the place you land, not the place you planned. And what she had found here, the work, the land, the daily application of everything she was actually capable of, had turned out to be as important as the man himself. And she suspected Garrett understood that, and she suspected he was glad. She was glad. She was not a person who used that word carelessly. She had lived long enough and carefully enough to know the difference between satisfied and glad, between grateful and genuinely quietly, durably happy in the particular way that comes not from circumstances going right, but from finding yourself in the right place for who you actually are. She was glad. On a warm evening in late October, the last warm evening before the real cold settled in, kind of evening Wyoming offers once in fall as a reminder of what it's taking away. Garrett and Eliza sat on the porch and Dolph was somewhere in the barn, and the ranch was entirely quiet. Garrett had a glass of water. She had her lukewarm tea. Neither of them had planned to sit there. They had both simply ended up there at the same time, which was how most of the important things between them had happened, not arranged, just arrived at mote. Silas wrote, Garrett said. She looked at him. Yesterday, he said. I forgot to mention it at supper. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded letter. He's doing well. The Laramie position is working out. He's been moved to a supervisory role for the winter feeding schedule. The man Aldridge apparently told him he has a head for the work. Course he does, she said. He asked us about the East Pasture close, Garrett said. He wanted to know how it finished. She smiled at that. Not a large smile. Just the small one she used when something genuine pleased her. What did you write back? I haven't yet, Garrett said. I was going to have you write it. She looked at him. You want me to write your letter to your brother? You'll tell him the numbers, he said. I'll just tell him it was good. She shook her head slightly. I'll write it tomorrow, she said. Quiet for a while. The valley below the East Pasture was settling into dusk, the shadows coming in long, and even from the west. She could see the creek line from where she sat, the northern bend, the one that had anchored the property's legal description in 1863 and in June of this year, and would anchor it for as long as the creek held its course, which would be longer than any of them needed to worry about. She had been thinking, in the weeks since October came in, about what the year had actually meant, not strategically, not in terms of accounts and margins and legal outcomes, but in the older sense what it had required of her and what it had given back, and whether the exchange was one she would make again. The answer was yes. The answer was clearly and entirely yes, and the clarity of it was as its own thing. She was not a person who arrived at certainty about large things quickly or easily, and the certainty she felt, sitting on this porch with this man beside her in the last warm evening of an extraordinary year, was not the certainty of someone who had found what they expected. It was the certainty of someone who had found something better than what they expected, and had the wit to recognize it. She had left Virginia, looking for room to think, room to be useful, room to be a full person in a life that fit the dimensions of who she actually was. She had found room in Wyoming, but not empty room. Room occupied by exactly the right kind of difficulty, kind that required her, the kind that asked everything she had and gave back the satisfaction of having given it. There was something worth saying about that. Not something she was going to say to Garrett. Not tonight, he knew it. She was fairly sure, in the way he knew most things about her, which was accurately and without fuss. But something worth saying to herself, sitting on this porch, with the valley going dark, that the life you build is always harder than the life you planned. The hardness is not the obstacle to the thing you want, it frequently is the thing, or at least the making of it. That the woman who arrived at Millhaven Station in March with $2 and a carpet bag and 6 months of letters had been capable of more than she knew, and the only way she had found that out was by being put in a situation that required it. You do not discover what you are in comfortable circumstances. You discover it when the 60-day clock is running and the debt is real and the boundary error needs to be found and the rebuttal needs to be written and the hearing needs to be won. She had discovered herself, in a sense, by having no choice but to be herself fully, without the protective half-measures that small spaces encourage. That was worth something. That was worth 1,200 miles and a freezing March morning, and 2 men in brown hats waiting on a platform, neither of whom had been exactly what she'd expected, both of whom had turned out to be exactly what she needed. She picked up her tea. Garrett was looking at the east pasture in the last light. "Good year," he said. She looked at the pasture, at the land that was theirs, documented and defended and growing in its own time. "Good year," she said. The darkness came in, from the east, the way it always did, steady and unhurried, and the first stars appeared above the mountains, and the October air began to carry the cold that would not leave now until spring. Somewhere across the valley, the coyote made its single thread-like sound and went quiet. Eliza Mercer Boone sat on her porch on her ranch in Wyoming and looked at the land she had come 1,200 miles to find, not knowing it was this specific land, not knowing it was this specific life, only knowing she was built for something larger than the life she was leaving. And she thought that of all the things she had gotten right in 31 years, getting on that train was the one she was most certain about. Not because everything had gone well, because everything that had gone hard had been worth going through. That was the difference. That had always been the difference between a life you endure and a life you actually live. Inside, the lamp was burning on the kitchen table, where the ledger sat closed with the year's good numbers inside it. Outside, the east pasture was dark, and the creek was running, and the cattle were settled in the winter pasture, where they were supposed to be. Everything was where it was supposed to be. She finished her tea. She went inside. The door closed behind her, and the porch was empty, and the night was clear, and the stars over Wyoming were the same stars they had always been, cold and distant, and entirely indifferent to human happiness, which was fine, because human happiness was not their responsibility. It never had been. That had always been the work of the people willing to do it.